Well, thank you very much, Mr. President. Very warm welcome. It's great to be back here. The last time I spoke at the Oxford Union that I can recall was a debate about professionalism in sport. Bobby Charlton was one of the paper speakers, and the two aspiring student speakers were myself and Theresa Brazier, whose future husband Philip May was presiding in the chair as president. So we've go back quite a long. Lucy and I have known Philip and Theresa for about 40 years. So it was quite an encounter when she became the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and we were able to meet again after all those years as Prime Ministers of our countries. So it's great to be here, and I want to thank you all for assembling in such large numbers. I thought what I would do today is talk about politics in the age of disruption. And I'll try to speak briefly, but I have to say to you, you don't have to be a cynic to believe that politicians will often disappoint you or mislead you, but you can never be more certain that a politician will mislead you than when he says, I will be brief. But I'm going to do my best to be brief. The politics has fundamentally changed much more rapidly than any of us imagine. Technology moves faster than our ability to understand it or comprehend it. And indeed, our technological imagination, that is to say, understanding the opportunities and what to do with technology, is slower than the pace of technology itself. Now, what we have seen in the course, literally in less than the lifetimes of the youngest among you, is a total transformation in the way the media operates around the world. The internet became, commercial, I would say, probably in the mid-90s, but you did not get the big social media applications emerging until the first decade of the 21st century, 2005, 2007, that era. 2007, of course, was when the first smartphone arrived too. But what you saw was a move from a world in which media was curated and expensive to produce, and a world in which media was extraordinarily cheap to produce and no longer curated. Now, what I mean by that was that if you wanted to get your message across to millions of people or thousands of people, you had to persuade the editor of a newspaper or the producer of a radio or TV program to, let you into their pages or onto their program. And of course, you needed to be able to do that, you needed to be a big corporation, whether it was government owned or not. And because you were a big business, generally, and because you wanted to maximise your audience in order to generate more advertising revenues, you went for the largest possible reach. The Sydney Morning Herald, which the Australians among you will know as the old long-standing broadsheet, or was a broadsheet in Sydney. The Sydney Morning Herald was founded in about 1840, and the first edition, they had on the front page some lines of Alexander Pope. In moderation placing all my glory, while Tories call me Whig and Whigs a Tory. Now, that was not because the old Fairfaxes were particularly broad-minded politically, but they were very commercial, and they knew they needed everybody in the political spectrum to buy their newspaper so they could maximise their advertising revenue. What's happened? The cost of news production has gone down to next to nothing. When I was a young television reporter, actually before I came here, in fact, in 1976, I came to Oxford in 78, I would go out with television camera, sound recordist, lighting assistant, cameraman. It was a whole team. It was a big deal, very expensive. Any of you have vastly more functionality in your iPhone, your smartphone, than I had as a television reporter in those days. So the cost of communication has dramatically come down. The economics of the media business has collapsed, although more slowly than I thought it would, frankly, at the time, because I was involved in starting the first big internet company in Australia in the 90s. But nonetheless, all of that has changed, and now you have a world where the mainstream media is less influential than ever. People can essentially select their own news. There is no curation, no filter, and of course people can, both from the publishing side and the consumer side, choose their own facts. So instead of being in a situation where we're all reading or watching essentially the same news, if you believe that, I am an alien working with the Illuminati to undermine Western civilization, there is undoubtedly a Facebook channel, a Twitter stream, and ample online resources to confirm and reinforce that view, and any other loopy opinions you may have. Look at the prevalence of the conspiracy theory websites, particularly in the US. So what we've gone from having mass media to a series of narrow casting silos. Increasingly people are able to select their own silo. And what that has done is dramatically change political discourse, because we are no longer talking about the same things. The context has dramatically changed. So what does that mean in terms of I'm speaking now as a practical politician. What does that mean? Well, in some respects, there are pluses, because it means that the cost for me as a politician, now a former politician, to communicate to the public is much lower. You can go around the media. Donald Trump, of course, does that more, more dramatically than anybody else, more comprehensively than anyone else. He goes straight, he is talking to the American people, indeed the world, through his Twitter account all the time. And whether you like what he says or not, the fact is that is going out unfiltered. There is no editor, no producer, nobody is able to call him out on that or prevent him from getting that message out. So that's one good thing about it. The problem, however, it means that ideas and propositions that are generally and genuinely wrong, unhinged, dangerous, can get legs in a way they couldn't before. Because before, the media had a degree of censorship in the sense that people, editors and journalists would say, oh, look, sorry, that's I'm not going to write that, that's nuts, or, we'll note that this person has made these allegations, but they've clearly got no basis, and they wouldn't get a run. We used to talk about, will something get a run? And when we talked about when something could get a run, it meant, would it get published in the mainstream media? Well, now you don't need to do that. Now I'll give you an example of something. There are many examples of this, but I'll give you a practical example of this that occurred in the 2016 election in Australia. As you many of you would know, this has been a tough period for incumbents. So we did well to stay in government in 2016, but we didn't do as well as we believed we should have done, or indeed we were tracking to do, until the last week or 10 days. What caused us to, end up with a majority of one as opposed to having another 5 or 6 seats? It was the most extraordinary scare. It's called the Medicare. Now, Medicare in Australia is essentially the national health, right? And it is the system where the government basically pays for your doctor's visits, and most of your medical needs are paid for one way or another by Medicare. And the Labor Party had started they'd started a sort of a scare, but it was running in a pretty low-key way, saying the Liberals are going to privatise Medicare, which is absurd, of course. It basically involves the federal government spending $25 billion a year, so it isn't even a business. You couldn't privatise it. So it is nonsense. And when it was raised in the House prior to the election, in a sort of throwaway line in question time, which, as the Australians know, is not nearly as decorous as Prime Minister's question time, a point Theresa May made yesterday. It was almost embarrassing. But then Labor decided to push it really hard, and it was denounced in the mainstream media. The Labor leader, Bill Shorten, was embarrassed whenever he was asked about it, because he couldn't defend it. But they pumped it out through social media. They pumped it out through digital messaging, text messaging. In fact, in the last couple of days of the campaign, people were getting text messages, and it was targeted at older people. It was absolutely targeted at older people who would be more likely to be worried about, medical care and so forth. And it purported to come from Medicare. So when you got it on your smartphone, you saw the sender appeared to be Medicare. And it said, watch out, the Liberals are going to sell Medicare. Well, I can tell you, that frightened a lot of people. And it absolutely worked. And in areas where you had older people, particularly, and this applied in Tasmania, it was a very big factor there, we saw quite a strong swing against us in that last week. So the Mediscare worked. Now, what did we learn? I'm not, complaining about that. I'm noting it. I'm beyond the indignation a long way. But so when that emerged, what was the advice that we had? The advice we had, which was conventional, was this is ridiculous. Don't talk about it. Don't spend too much time on it because you will give it greater salience. You'll amplify it, in fact. Now, that is true in the old world. Because, for example, in the old world of the mainstream media, if someone makes a crazy claim, and if I'm assuming I'm the Prime Minister, as I was at that time, the Prime Minister responds to it, that gives it legs, that gives it oxygen, that makes it a story in and of itself. So the conventional wisdom has been to ignore this stuff. But the truth is, in the digital age, when there is no mainstream media, there's no creation and everyone's got their own channel, you cannot let any of these things get ahead of steam. So we didn't do that, and we didn't deal with it. It was a mistake. We had a by-election at the end of 2017 when Labor ran exactly the same technique, and we treated it like whack-a-mole. And every time this story came up, we hit it really hard in social media. We had ministers out, and it was ineffective. And so, but what it means is that you can no longer rely on the curation or the responsibility, if you like, of the mainstream media to protect the public against wild messages, fake news, scares. It's a very, very challenging environment, and it means you've got to be fighting on all fronts all the time. So this is one of the reasons why, and I'll just conclude on this point and perhaps have some discussion. This is one of the reasons why you're seeing this rise of populism. And you're seeing, there are a lot of other economic reasons, slow wages growth is a big part of it. But this change in the media, which is absolutely fundamental, and remember, the media in a democracy are as important and as fundamental a part of that democracy as the parliaments or the courts. That's literally, it's all, journalists of the media play as important a part. But they've been undermined by the arrival of social media, and of course are now increasingly, in order to try to hang on to eyeballs, emulating them in terms of their irresponsibility and scare them and fact-free approaches, and of course they don't have the money to do the research. A journalist, I remember working for a weekly magazine. I used to have to write 1, maybe 2 articles a week. Journalists nowadays are belting them out, articles out, on the hour, because they've got to do that to keep up the feed. So it's a very different environment, and one that requires a much more proactive approach to defend our democracy. It's a very, very challenging one. It's fueling populism and enabling it. It's very difficult to respond to, but the only way, I think, to deal with it, and this is built out based on our own experience, is being relentlessly committed to knocking every lie down as soon as it is uttered. Don't worry about giving it more salience. It's going to get salience anyway, because the social media will do that. So it's a tougher environment, and this is one of the reasons why we're seeing this is enabling and amplifying the tides of populism that we've seen. So on that cheerful note, I'd be happy to take some questions and look forward to a discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the speech, and I thought I'd follow up on that. In this post-truth politics age, where does the onus lie to combat it, as you were just saying before you finished? Is the onus on the individual to look at whatever story it is and rebut it themselves? Is it on the platforms, whether that be Facebook or a journal, to themselves rebut it? Or is it on government to legislate against it?
Well, in an age of free speech, in a sort of an environment of free speech, where free speech is an important freedom, you can't really legislate against false news or fake news or misleading statements, because, particularly in a political context, because it will be very, it's always arguable, right? I think the only way you can deal with it, and you can't expect that the platforms, I think, have got to do a much better job at policing hate speech and speech that is calculated to incite, violence or terrorism. But in terms of political speech, and which is more in the, it may be fake, it may be outrageous, it may be a scare, but it's hard to expect a Facebook or a Twitter to police that. They don't have the means to do so anyway. The answer, I think, has to be for the participants in the debate, relevantly, politicians or activists or whatever, have got to be prepared to call this stuff out. And so in other words, what I'm saying is, don't be concerned about a response giving a crazy claim salience. It's likely to get that anyway. Knock it on the head as quickly as possible. And that requires so much more active. I mean, it is a completely different approach to media management than what, people were doing a decade ago, let alone, 40 odd years ago when I was a young reporter.
So it seems, as a point you made earlier about now how easy it is to produce news, it used to be the case that in order to acquire news, you had to pay for it. Whereas now there is no need to pay for news because there's so much of it on, whether it be Facebook or other sites.
Which is why, of course, from a journalist's point of view, journalists today have more readers than ever, but they've got no business, there's no business model left.
So do you think that's what's at the heart of this, that actually there needs to find a way of financing effective and researched and resourced news, but the problem is who's now going to pay for it?
People, there's so much of it that's free, and I think, how many of you rely on social media for most of your news? Most of you? Yeah. I think that's true everywhere. I mean, a friend of mine who's a very distinguished journalist, actually, former editor, was teaching a journalism class at a university in Australia, and she said to her class of all would-be journalists, she said, "Where do you get most of your news?" And they said, Twitter and Facebook and stuff. Fair enough. And she said, "Do you know which sources it's coming from? Was it the New York Times or the Guardian or Times or the FT or the BBC?" No one really knew. They hadn't taken any notice of that. And so she actually, her first exercise was to get them to go back and do that research. So it is dramatically different, and the point is this has changed so quickly.
Do you think that then this is a reflection of the kind of bipartisan nature of politics, and that actually the kind of consensus building element of politics is disintegrating? And do you think that caused the change in the media, or is it the other way around?
I think consensus is diminishing, and I think you've got the moderating influence of mainstream media is no longer there. It's why institutions like the BBC here or the ABC in Australia are more important than ever. But they have got, I can't speak for the BBC, and at our ABC, I had a few sort of run-ins with them, but not because they were, like people on my side of politics always say the ABC is full of lefties, and I think one of John Howard's advisors said, because most of the people who watch the ABC tend to vote Liberal, used to say it's our enemies talking to our friends. But my concern was accuracy. That was my only concern, because it is very helpful to have at least one major news outlet which is committed to being accurate. But of course, if you're there at the ABC or perhaps the BBC and everyone else is off in opinion land, and everyone else is making their own facts to suit their own sensational proposition and drive clicks, it's hard not to be carried away with that. But the ABC, at least in my country, has got a statutory obligation to do so. I think the running to the extremes is a major problem. I mean, you get the feeling, I mean, it's oft quoted, but it's the Yeats's great poems, the Second Coming is very apt. The things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. The best lack all conviction and the worst are full of passionate intensity. It does sound a bit like the political environment in many countries today. I think this media construct is informing that. From Australia's point of view, we have a couple of things going for us, which and I'd rather than compare it with the UK, I'll just compare it with the US, for example. One thing we've got going for us is compulsory voting. Look, I'm a libertarian, I'm a liberal, so I don't think people should be forced to do very much at all, but I actually do think compulsory voting is a good idea. And the reason for that is, in a political campaign, you don't have to run off to the extremes to get the vote out. You don't have to go off to, get people motivated to come and vote, because they've all got to vote. They get fined $100 if they don't. So that's good. The other thing we have in Australia is that our electorates are independently assessed. So we don't have gerrymanders the way they do in America. See, one of the problems in the US, and if it's a problem in the US, it's a problem for the world, is that the electorates are, for the most part, gerrymandered so that they can only be won either by the Democrats or the Republicans. There are very few genuinely contestable seats in the Congress. So if you've got a seat that has been so gerrymandered that only the Republican Party can win it, the contest for you as a candidate is not the general election, but the primary. And again, therefore, you've got to go off to secure the support of the party activists, who tend to be naturally much more extreme in their views than the community, than the public. So again, I think our system supports people steering closer to the centre, but there are still forces that would, pushing politics to the side, but I think recent events in Australia indicate that is not the way to be successful electorally, in my country at least.
Then I wanted to pick up on that point, but look at it in a slightly different context, in your passing of same-sex marriage through the referendum.
Yeah.
And we are going through a problem in this country where a referenda is not led to an outcome that a representative democracy can deal with well, but it seemed to work successfully in Australia. So where do you think referenda can work in representative systems, and where doesn't it?
Well, I think direct democracy is, generally speaking, not a great idea. I mean, there's a reason why we invented, our forebears invented parliaments, and that is because to get people together to confer and hopefully change each other's minds and hopefully find solutions in the middle. That's what it's all about. With same-sex marriage in Australia, it was a very, very divisive issue on my side of politics, particularly. It had been almost as difficult an issue as climate change, which of course, as all the Australians know, has been, a toxic issue in on the centre-right side of politics for a very long time. Very destructive and divisive issue. But with same-sex marriage, Abbott had made a commitment to having a vote, which I inherited that commitment. We ended up having, for various reasons, a postal vote, which was entirely voluntary. And I'm so proud that 80% of Australians participated. It's really amazing when you think about it. They had absolutely no obligation at all, no fines, nothing. Just got a letter in the mail, 80% participated, 63% voted yes. So that worked. But it was a fairly straightforward proposition. Should same-sex couples be allowed to marry? Or should the law be changed to allow same-sex couples to marry? I think what always disturbed me about the Brexit referendum, and I'm not here to give the British advice about whether they should stay in the EU or not. What troubles me about it is there was no analysis of what leaving would actually involve, of the costs or the detail, the implications. It was essentially an invitation to give uninformed consent to a sentiment. And of course, so the referendum basically invited people to, grasp a column of smoke, leave, with no particularity. I mean, people knew what the status quo was, and they, a majority, not a big majority, voted for it. and of course now Parliament can't agree. So, you know, what you needed, it is, and just, you know, as we were saying earlier, in democracies typically governments, for whatever reason, become unpopular. You know, that they tend to become unpopular more quickly now than they used to, but they, for whatever reason they do, there's an election, the people toss them out, put the other parties in, who then inevitably disappoint because they end up making similar mistakes to their predecessors. But, you know, there is a process. The problem you've got here in the UK is it seems that the system can't cope with it, the Parliament can't deal with it, both sides of politics are divided, and there isn't a majority in the House of Commons for any proposition. And, you know, I have to say I have enormous admiration for the Prime Minister's gritty determination to battle with this. And, you know, as I think I was saying earlier, she and I debated here all those years ago, and she's always been a very, very determined person, and she's needing every ounce of that in this struggle at the moment. But it seems to me here that the challenge is that people in Britain are looking at their political system and saying this is not a question of the government's made a hash of it, let's turf them out and put in the opposition. The system isn't working, the system is failing. And I think that's potentially much more dangerous.
And then my final question before we hand over to the audience is, do you think that stems from the fact that parties now themselves are starting to have more disagreements internally than they did before, and like the case of the Liberal Party in Australia? Do you think it's a uniquely, as you said within an interview with Andrew Neil yesterday that came out today, that it's an Australian phenomenon?
The coup in August that brought my prime ministership to an end was certainly madness. Whether it was I described it as a peculiarly Australian form of madness. It certainly wasn't an Australian form of madness. How unique it was, others can judge. But I think the challenge that we faced in my party, frankly, was this. In a political party, there is a premise, and the premise is that if this is the party room, we thrash an issue out, and if the majority want to go that way, then the rest say, yep, you know, we'll go along with that. You know, they're the rules of the road. What we've increasingly seen in the Liberal Party is that the right of the party, and that's a term that, you know, is not terribly precise, increasingly are taking the view that if they don't get what they want, they're prepared to blow the show up. And you see that in other parties in other parts of the world. You know, that element of collegiality is absolutely critical, because that's why you're a party as opposed to just a room full of independents. And so that's a very, very big challenge, I think. With that energy policy that we had, it had overwhelming support in the party room and overwhelming support in the community, but we had a minority in the party room that basically said we will cross the floor and therefore potentially bring the government down to vote against it. And that was one of the things that triggered the events that occurred. Now that is, I sort of see kind of some resonant, elements in the Brexit debate that seems to be a bit like that. You probably you follow it more closely than me. But that is a real issue, and again, that is driven in part by the singularity, of the way the media operates. You know, everyone can be the star on their own Facebook channel. Everyone can be the star on their own Twitter stream. Everyone can be the star, you know, even on broadcast media. Now, instead of having a couple of channels, you've got an infinite variety of outlets, particularly with subscription television. So, there it is.
Thank you very much. Now let's hand over questions to the audience. If you want to just put your hands up and wait for the microphone to be brought to you, then stand up when it does. So we'll go to the hand in the aisle first.
What do you think, rightly or wrongly, will be your legacy?
Well, my legacy is everything I've done, but I've done it, and I've done a lot. To be frank with you, I got a lot more done as Prime Minister than I thought I would. given the constraints both within my own party, but above all in the Parliament. We had a one-seat majority in the House of Representatives, and we were absolutely in a minority in the Senate. We needed almost all of the crossbench, almost all of the independents in the Senate to get anything passed. But we got big tax reforms passed, we got big school reforms passed, we got huge changes to our national security legislation passed. We got much more through the Parliament than anyone thought we would. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I'd have a press conference in the Prime Minister's courtyard and someone in the gallery would say, "Prime Minister, why won't you admit you've got no chance of getting this through the Senate?" And I'd say, "Oh well, I'm just going to plug away and do my best." And often, this is where discretion is very important. There was a rather complicated exercise at the beginning of 2016 when we managed to ensure that we got a double dissolution trigger over a big industrial bill. The Australians probably are familiar with it, but it was very complex to do it. And a lot of the news reporters were saying, the government doesn't have a plan, it's rudderless, Prime Minister has no plan. And then when we revealed exactly what we were doing, I was able to say, you've just got to remember, just because you don't know what my plan is doesn't mean I don't have a plan. And it is, this is why confidentiality is very important. One of the things I sought to do as Prime Minister was ensure that Cabinet was confidential. And I was more successful than most of my predecessors in that regard. If you want a good Cabinet government operates like this, you make sure you're very well informed, you consider a wide range of options, you consult widely, you have a good debate about it with your colleagues, all in secret, you make a decision and then you announce it at the time of your own choosing. Now that sounds like a penetrating glimpse of the obvious to all of you, I'm sure, but it's almost, it is quite rare in a lot of parliamentary democracies. So maintaining that discipline is critically important. So I've got a lot of good things done. We mentioned gay marriage. Why don't I touch on climate change? I mentioned that we weren't able to get the final part of the energy policy through, although we got most of it through. But one of the best things I did was set up, and it's being built now, what will be the Southern Hemisphere's largest and one of the world's largest pumped hydro schemes. We've seen extraordinary disruption in energy, and we have moved into a world where we have increasing amounts of zero marginal cost generation, basically wind and solar, particularly PV I'm talking about. And in Australia, of course, we've got plenty of big country, lots of sun, lots of good wind resources. The problem is the sun doesn't shine all the time and the wind doesn't blow all the time. So how do you back it up? And this is one of the things that have been largely overlooked, and it's been overlooked in many countries. And so I got underway a big program of pumped hydro. Snowy 2.0, as you might have heard of, is the single biggest one, but there are others. And what that will do is make renewables reliable. And it's not rocket science. When the wind is blowing in the middle of the night or the sun is shining everywhere in the middle of the day, energy is cheap, you pump the water up the hill, you lose about 25% on the round trip, and then you run it down. But of course the spread between the cheapest energy and the dearest energy is gigantic. And when, on a hot afternoon when the wind drops and the solar panel's not working, you open the gate valve and you generate the water from the water going downhill. So we can, and I just speak for my own country, we in Australia have the capacity to have absolutely zero emissions energy. But you've got to use engineering and economics to get there. You can't wave a magic wand. You've got to stagger the retirements of the old coal-fired plants. But the big pumped hydro scheme is a huge enabler. It's the single biggest enabler of renewable energy that's been undertaken, and it's now very widely accepted, and it will have other counterparts across the nation.
Yeah, let's go to the hand down here, you sir.
Thanks very much. You talked briefly about the challenge of party constraints within the Liberal Party, and a lot of criticism during your premiership was that the Malcolm Turnbull sort of pre-2015 sort of climate change campaigner, Republic advocate was missing. The voice was missing.
Yeah.
And a lot of people said that was because it's the Big Tent party, you're trying to balance different voices in the party.
Yeah.
So what's the future of sort of big tent parties like the Liberals or like Labour when you've got a rising number of independents, both here and in Australia as well? Is there a future for the big tent party when there is such a diversity of voices?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I'll come back to defending my honour in a minute, but I think that's a very good point, and it gets back to that point I made about the premise of a big tent party or any political party. If you've got groups within it that are not prepared to go along with the consensus, then it really can't work. If you've got the premise has got to be that we find a consensus and we go along with it. If everyone is letting their conception of the perfect to be the enemy of the good, it won't work. And I think you may see more parties, smaller parties, as a result. Just getting back to my own record, it's interesting because people say, Malcolm, I don't like speaking about myself in the third person, that is really nutty, but people would say that I, was a strong supporter of action on climate change, strong supporter of legalising same-sex marriage and a Republican. Now in all of those issues, the only one I didn't proceed with was the Republic, and the reason for that was it had no prospect of success at the current time. I mean, in the Republic referendum in '99, I said if we vote no, it'll mean no for a long time, and the next opportunity to get this issue on the agenda is after the end of the Queen's reign. That's still my view. I'm not one of those, and this perhaps marks me as why I'm not a natural member of the left. I'm not given to heroic defeats. I like tough, hard, clawing, inglorious victories. Climbing, crawling over the line, just to score. That's how I like to win. And, the next Republican referendum should be at a time when you can win, and that will not be until after the end of the Queen's reign. That's my view, and I've had that for 20 years. So that's what I want. On gay marriage, I delivered it. It's legal. So it's pretty hard to say I lack conviction on that. On climate policy, it is a terribly difficult issue in my party, and it is basically, it's almost impossible to get enough consensus to get anything done there, and particularly when you've got a minority that's prepared to, blow the place up, or threaten to blow the place up. But I think the reforms that we made, the hydro reforms I talked about earlier, they are actually in many ways more significant than any piece of legislation. Because what that means is that if I was running an energy company today in Australia, and I had to, and Snowy 2's been built, there are other pumped hydro projects being built, and customer comes to me and says, look, I want 250 megawatts dispatchable power 24/7. I've got a factory or a big, huge industrial concern that needs that. There is no way you would build a coal-fired power station. You'd be nuts. You're absolutely nuts. You can now deliver dispatchable power, a combination of wind and solar and storage, pumped hydro, battery, maybe some firming from gas. There'll probably always be a role for that. But you can deliver that at a much lower cost. So the point is, the good news is that we can move, we've got to plan it carefully and plan the exits and the replacements. We can move to zero emission energy. It is absolutely doable. It will be cleaner, naturally. It will also be cheaper. Technology is our friend. I mean, the PV module, the heart of the kit that's in a solar panel, of course, there's a lot of other things associated with the cost of a solar panel, but the PV module itself, 10 years ago, was $2 a watt. It's now I mean, someone here might have the latest figures, it's below 20 cents a watt, and it's going lower. The next generation of photovoltaic cells, the technology of which, by the way, has been done at the University of New South Wales, which has played an extraordinary role in this area, will in effect increase the efficiency of these panels by 50%. So a 330 watt panel, which is essentially what, if you go, put some solar panels on your roof, that's what you've got, that's what you'll get. But 330 watt panel will become a 500 watt panel. So this, particularly in a place like Australia, where we get a lot of sunshine, energy is going to be very cheap. The problem is the intermittency, and that's where storage is the big game changer. So I'm very confident we can do that, but you've got to deal with the fossil fuel lobby, and you've got to deal with people who, as I used to say, we've got to deal with this energy issue with engineering and economics, not ideology and idiocy. And a lot of the sort of, climate change deniers, the, coal is good type of lobby nowadays are essentially in that area. And they're basically running the risk, I think, politically, of being on the side of higher emissions and more expensive electricity. And that is not a combination you want to be in.
And then let's go behind 2 rows in front.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My question is, what lessons do you think the Democratic Party need to learn from the 2016 presidential election, and how would they go about winning the White House in 2020, in your view?
Oh, crumbs. Well, that is. I don't claim to be an expert on American politics at all. The Americans here would have a better understanding of this. I never understood the extent, the antipathy towards Hillary Clinton. There's no doubt she's a very polarising figure, and a lot of people were really motivated not to vote for her. I found, from an Australian point of view, looking at across the Pacific, I couldn't really understand that. So that was obviously, having the right candidate is critically important. It's an unusual process in America, isn't it? Because in our system, in our parliamentary systems, you always have an alternative prime minister. The leader of the opposition is sometimes referred to as the alternative prime minister. But in America, there is no leader of the opposition. I mean, maybe it's Nancy Pelosi, but she's not going to run for president. So they've now got just about everyone seems to be running in the presidential race. Donald Trump will be a very formidable opponent. He's a phenomenal communicator. Whether you like what he's communicating is another question, but he has taken the social media platforms and used it more effectively, I think, than any other leading political figure in my time. So I haven't answered your question, but that's because I don't know who the great champion on the Democratic side, Democratic Party would be. Some people talk about Beto O'Rourke. I don't know the young the politician in Texas, but again, I don't know these people. I don't know enough about it to say much more.
Yeah, let's go to the hand in the back, you sir.
Thank you very much, Malcolm, for this speech today. Similar question to before. Given the hostility of internal party politics within Australia, do you think we might see a disintegration of those major parties, both in Australia and across the world?
Well, in a way, you've seen a disintegration of the left. Disintegration is not the right word. So you've seen in the rise of the Greens a substantial political force in Australia on the left already. The Labor Party has it's both an advantage and a disadvantage. I think nowadays it's probably more of an advantage. Has the advantage of being the political wing of the trade union movement. So it's got that solidity, that foundation of the unions, their resources, both human and material, both human and financial, and that gives them a weight and a solidity that other parties lack. One of the problems political parties, like big grassroots membership parties like the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party make the same observation about here, one of the problems they have is that fewer and fewer people are joining political parties. When I joined the Liberal Party in Wentworth, and where I live in Sydney, which I represented in Parliament for 14 years, basically, the middle class, business class, the bank manager and the bank chairman, the local solicitor and the QC, the GP and the Macquarie Street specialist. There were people from all of those backgrounds in the Liberal Party. You could find they were represented there. It was basically, it was a very broad, it was a big tent party, as the gentleman was saying earlier. Nowadays, the political parties have not got that same depth of membership. Everyone has been struggling with this problem. People aren't joining. I mean, Robert Putnam, has written a lot about it. The American sociologist from Harvard who wrote Bowling Alone. Why is it that, for example, my generation are not the baby boomers are not joiners in the way their parents were joiners of anything. Of lodge, whether it's the Masonic Lodge or the Rotary or Apex or any of these service organisations, people don't join them anymore either. So that creates a real problem then if your membership is out of touch with the electorate. And this is why I think it can be quite challenging when you have your party leaders chosen by your membership. And the Labor Party here really has to reflect on this somewhat. If your membership are even less in touch or less aligned with the people whose votes they need to win government than the members of Parliament are, you can end up with representation that makes it harder for you to connect and to win.
Let's take another question. Sir, down in the front.
Just wondering how you think Australia best navigates its role as an American ally, which is sort of very economically dependent on China, and in particular what your view on the Belt and Road Initiative is.
Well, I mean, we welcome investment in infrastructure everywhere. In terms of Belt and Road, we were asked at one point, people said that, my government hadn't signed up to Belt and Road. Well, that's not true. We didn't. Belt and Road is a slogan. It's like asking someone to sign up to Jobs and Growth, really, that was my slogan in 2016, not very original, hasten to add. But our view is, show us the project and we'll sign up to it or not, whether we think it's a good deal. I think it's really important that infrastructure investment, particularly in the developing world, is done in a way that supports good governance, that supports equity, economic development in a fair and just way, and above all does not burden countries with unsustainable levels of debt. And there have been some of the criticisms that have been made. The US alliance is, will survive many, many prime ministers and presidents and senators and congressmen. It is built on shared values and on the shared histories, values, commitments of millions of people, as indeed our relationship with the United Kingdom is. So, I think that's, we are together, we're joined at the hip because we basically see the world in very similar ways, in different ways, clearly, but very closely. In terms of China, we have my government had a very clear-eyed relationship with China, very positive one. We have a good friend in Beijing, but we defend our interests. When I was Prime Minister, I defended my interests with anyone. I've had some fairly robust conversations with Mr. Trump too. But we don't see there being a need to choose between China and the United States. They're two different propositions from our point of view. The United States is our ally, is our treaty ally. It is the bedrock of that relationship is the bedrock of our security, as it is of yours, and that's not going to change.
Yeah, say the hand there in the...
When I say yours, I meant the UK's. I'm sorry, I know. I was speaking to the crowd, not just to you.
Thank you, Mr. Turnbull, for that excellent presentation. You talked a bit about the particularly Australian madness regarding the coup of your removal last year.
Yeah.
That's presumably part of a wider political dysfunction in Australia regarding removal of leaders. With the full benefit of hindsight, do you regret the circumstances of your own removal of Mr. Abbott? And would you similarly characterise that?
No.
So I guess then the question is, why wouldn't you characterise that similarly as a coup?
Well, because you've got to judge these things by their outcomes, right? I mean, the government was in a cabinet government had collapsed effectively under Abbott. I gave a speech about it. I mean, I'm a plain, blunt man. So, I was very clear about why I was challenging him. I felt the guy had got to the position where I couldn't continue to serve in the government, so I thought I would give the party room the option of having me as leader instead. And if I hadn't been successful, I would have left the parliament immediately. There was a change of leader. I became the leader. We went from being unelectable to being way ahead in the polls. That continued for quite a while. We saw quite a change of mood in the country. It was absolutely the right thing to do, and what I promised I would deliver economic leadership, I did. You know, my prime ministership saw the strongest jobs growth of anyone, any prime minister. So you know, we really delivered on that, and you know, for various reasons, the 2016 election was closer than would have otherwise been, but we did win. Big point, right? We won the election, and we then delivered an enormous amount after the election. If you compare that to August, the government was delivering, getting important legislation through the parliament. We were on the public polls 51-49 behind, so 2 points behind, but which is, you all understand what I'm talking about, the margin of error. That's effectively level pegging. I mean, whether it's 51-49 or 49-51 statistically is the same thing. More importantly, we were ahead on our own polling in the marginal seats because, our House of Representatives has 150 seats, and we typically poll in 40 of them. Roughly our 20 most marginal and their 20 most marginal. And we were ahead there. There was no question the government was absolutely electable. Would I have won the election? I think I would have. A lot of other people do. A lot of Labor people think we would have because of the benefits of incumbency. But on any view, we were absolutely electable and competitive. And so how do you explain the coup? And this is why it's been described as complete and utter madness. I mean, you can sometimes replace a leader with a potentially more popular leader, and it won't work out. But in this case, the people behind the coup, I think, were more interested in removing me than actually putting somebody else in. And that's why I think for some of them, they were more concerned that I would win the election than that I would lose it. I know that does seem mad, and I put that point to Andrew Neil, and he was a bit taken aback. But if you've been there, and there are plenty of people who've participated in the process who would agree with what I said. But that's why I say it was madness. And don't, just make this other point. You've always got to try, in every walk of life, you've got to try to put yourself in the other person's shoes. So you need to have emotional empathy, you need to be able to, think about, particularly in business and negotiations, what is going to be good for them? How can I make my proposition compelling for them? Like in you can see in the transcript of the phone call with Trump, you can see how I've gone there and, and patiently explained why it's in his interest to agree with me, contrary to, where he started. So that's your job as an advocate. But so you assume, and Paul Keating used to say this all the time, actually it was Jack Lang's originally, but great old Australian saying, in the great race of life, always back self-interest because you know it's trying. Now, people can sometimes misperceive their self-interest, but in the coup in August, it is very, very hard. Most people can't understand the way it was the way it was fomented. And of course you get in a political party, if you create enough chaos and uproar, people will be in effect panicked into voting for change in order to stop the horror. And that, that's that's why I think political parties are well placed to have measures like the Tories do here, which say that if you have a spill and you can't, and it's unsuccessful, you can't have another one in 12 months. I think that's actually a good rule. I think you've got to put some brakes on this, because you cannot assume that people are always acting entirely rationally, or that they're not being panicked. That's a very important element. The emotional, irrational element is one you've got to take account for.
And then let's take one final question from the hand by the wall.
Thank you again, Mr. Turnbull, for coming to speak to us. You spoke at the end of your speech about sort of disruption in the age of populism, and how do you think the centre-right should respond to that? Do you think it should try and pander to the populisms of either the left or the right by sort of, attacking left economically, or trying to put some clear blue water between it and the centre, and by attacking to the right? Or do you think there's still a place for a sort of centrist approach, trying to sort of be that voice of moderation rather than trying to sort of pander to the forces behind
I think you've got to steer for the centre. That's my firm belief. It's particularly true in Australia with compulsory voting. Those who go off to the extreme, narrow casting to a noisy constituency, who maybe sort of, people in Australia, the Liberal politics would talk about the base, and people would say to me, you've got to throw red meat to the base. So some very conservative things I should do, or things that are seen as, when I say, I'll come back to conservatism in a minute, but the base, the real base of a political party is not actually its membership. The real base is the people who habitually vote for you. And if you go too far off to one extreme, you will get people who have voted for you for years who will stop voting for you. And that is exactly what happened in the Victorian state election, where you had absolutely roll gold safe Liberal seats, that had always been held by the Liberal Party, that swung to Labor. People that would never have occurred to them to vote Labor. They voted Labor as a protest about what happened in August and associated events. Coming back to conservatism, a lot of the populists on the right, claim to be conservatives, or people use the adjective conservatism, and for the benefit of the Australians here, I'd say they don't know the difference between Edmund Burke or Tony Burke. Or Burke's backyard, for that matter, or Backer Burke. The fact is that conservatives respect institutions. They respect institutions. They value tradition. They value continuity. Most of these so-called populists on the right are disruptors and challengers of all of that. So whatever they are not conservatives.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, that's all we've got time for. But ladies and gentlemen, please do join with me in thanking Malcolm Turnbull.
Thank you.